So willpower alone obviously isn't enough to kind of help us sustain change. Where does that leave us? What I want to talk about next is habits, and how understanding, analyzing, and reworking some of our habits can give us some chance for creating sustaining change, right? So habits, scientists say, exist because the brain is constantly looking for ways to save effort, right? Our brain's essentially lazy, and left to its own devices, the brain will try to make almost any routine into a habit. And Charles Duhigg, who wrote this wonderful book called The Power of Habit, says that the process of habit in our brains is a 3-step loop. And so I kind of want to walk through it so we all have an understanding. It says first there's a cue. And the cue is basically a trigger that tells our brain to go into automatic mode and which habit to use. Then there's a routine. And the routine is basically an action. It can be a physical action, but it can also be a mental or kind of emotional action as well. It can be external or internal. And then there's a reward. And the reward is there to let our brain know, is this loop worth remembering, right? So over time, this loop of cue, routine, reward becomes more and more automatic until there's a powerful sense of neurobiological craving that emerges, right? So that's when we experience the cue and our brain starts craving the reward, that's when the habit really gets locked in. Right. So habits are not destiny, but they are very powerful. And habits can be changed, ignored, and replaced. But the reason that the discovery of the habit loop was so important is that it reveals this basic and fundamental truth, that when habit emerges, the brain stops fully participating in decision making. It stops working so hard and diverts focus to something else. So unless we deliberately fight a habit, unless we find new routines, habits will kind of emerge automatically and almost without our consent. And there's a reason for that. So when we were talking about willpower, when we were really talking about our prefrontal cortex and our frontal cortex, right? This is where executive decision, this is where choice lies. For some of us argue this is where kind of the seat of consciousness lies, right? This is where the thinking, deciding, rationalizing part of the brain is. This is not where habits live. Habits live in our basal ganglia, which is way down here, which is a much more primitive, much faster part of the brain. And what's really interesting is that once that craving starts existing in a habit, right, once it gets locked in there, it gets stored in here permanently. You cannot delete a habit. Once it's in there, it's in there. So you can't just be like, I'm going to stop that habit. Because it can remain in there literally for years and years and years, even if the cue and the reward hasn't been present. They did this really kind of weird study, but where they essentially put these receptors in the brains of alcoholics that prevented them from receiving any kind of pleasure from alcohol, and they said, you know what, this is going to cure alcoholism, right? Turned out didn't work, right? So and I think part of that reason why is this, right? So we still have cues to drink, and our brain will still go into automatic mode and be like, well, when this happens, I drink, right? And so it doesn't really get at that. Yeah. And so in order to kind of rework a habit, scientists, psychologists, social scientists have come at it a bunch of different ways throughout the years, and they found that there's really only one way that works. And we have to keep the same cue, provide the same reward, and the only thing we can really mess around is the routine. This is called the golden rule of habit change. And I know this feels a little bit abstract, so I want to kind of put it in context of addiction and recovery so we can get a sense of how this might work. So here's a habit loop that most people are probably pretty familiar with, right? So here's our friend right here. We're going to say the cue is kind of an internal cue, and it's a feeling of maybe feeling anxious, right? The routine is he has a few drinks or gets drunk, and the reward is that he feels momentary relief, right? And so over time, this becomes more and more automatic until as soon as he starts feeling anxious, he starts craving that relief, and that's when this habit loop really gets locked in. So let's apply the golden rule of habit change to this loop to see what it might look like. Right? So cues and rewards have to stay the same. The only place we can mess around with it is the routine. So Our friend over here is feeling anxious. This time he goes and, let's say, talks to his sponsor about that anxiety and then feels relief. So it can take a little bit of time and a little bit of work to insert these new routines, but over time they can become more and more automatic.